Big thank you for everyone for being here today. It's a real honor and privilege to be able to welcome you here. I promise I don't have actually this much to read. I'm just really blind so I can't see, but it's short, I promise. Anyways, my name is Allison. I'm the Penn Israel ambassador here at Penn Hillel. And whether you're a Hillel regular or it's your first time in the building, I want to say thank you. Firstly, thank you for making time to continue the conversation about anti-Zionism, dual narratives, and long-term peace. Thank you for being open to learning from others who hold views very different from your own. But most importantly, and this I really mean like from the bottom of my heart, thank you for showing up and being here today. The act alone sends a message that mutual understanding is an attainable reality, and you're making the fact that you're here, it takes us one step closer. So while we're on the subject of thank yous, there's a group of individuals who have dedicated hours to making this event possible. To everyone on the Penn Israel Alliance, or PIA, they're sitting in the front here. Your dedication and commitment really inspires me personally. If I don't tell you guys that often enough, please know that it does. And it's been a real privilege to be a part of this group. To Ira, Sophie, the Penn Hillel staff and board of directors, please know that today will come and go, but the mark you leave on us as students will stay with us for a very, very long time. Okay, got that out of the way. We're going, moving. A few words about our speakers today. Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, where he co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative. Yossi is the author of Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, a heartfelt plea for peace and new dialogue based on common ground and faith. Yossi has been active in Middle East reconciliation work and serves as the chairman of Open House, an Arab-Israeli Jewish center near Tel Aviv. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Jewish Studies from Brooklyn College and an MS in Journalism from Northwestern University. He moved to Israel in 1982 and lives in Jerusalem with his wife, Sarah, and their 3 children. Yossi will be joined today in conversation by Rabbi Mike Purim, the executive director of Penn Hillel, in conversation about the nature of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the role of U.S. Jewry, and of course his book and the responses he has received since publishing Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. About halfway through the program, we will begin collecting questions from all of you. So you might have found an index card on your chair when you came in. Please hold on to that. If you didn't, we'll make sure to come around with them. And there's also pens in the back on that chair if you don't have with you. So those index cards are for your questions. And if they come up at any time during the conversation here, feel free to write them down and pass them to the aisles. So let's say, other than this out because of that thing, let's pass them that way. But really any end, and we'll be walking down and just collecting the questions and bring them up to Rabbi Mike, who will be asking them to Yossi. If your question doesn't get asked for some reason, please feel free to stick around until the end of the event, and you'll be able to get a chance to talk. But most importantly, I just want to say thank you to Yossi, thank you Rabbi Mike for being here, and thank you to all of you. Let's do this.
Hi, everybody. Do I need this? Yeah? All right. Allison, thank you. Rabbi Mike, thank you. And really, Ira, everyone. I'm just delighted to be here and to see just how rich Jewish life is at Penn. It's very moving to see this, and I'm just really thrilled, actually, to be with all of you. So, some words about this book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, which I published last year. And Letters is a series of outreach of letters to an invisible, anonymous Palestinian neighbor. Someone whose lights I can see from my porch at the edge of Jerusalem where I live. I live in a neighborhood some of you may know, called Penn Hillel, which is northeast Jerusalem. And I live literally in the last row of houses before the desert, before the West Bank, and before the wall that separates my neighborhood from my neighbors. And often, when I can't sleep, which is often, I find myself at 3, 4 in the morning looking out at the lights across the way and listening to the muezzin, the call to prayer, which sounds like it's reverberating in my living room. And during one of these bouts of insomnia, I found myself speaking to my neighbor and saying all of the things that I wished Palestinians understood about us, and wishing that I could hear from my neighbor about their lives and what I don't know about them. And I sat down and started writing, "Dear neighbor, I don't know your name or anything else about you. I call you neighbor because you're anonymous to me. But I look at your lives, I hear your call to prayer, and I feel this intimacy between us." And I just started writing. And what I ended up writing was a series of explanations about who the Jewish people are, what our story is, why we are there, why we came home, why we call it home. And no one has ever done this before, which is astonishing to me. We're 100 years of conflict with the Palestinians, with the Arab world generally. And we do a very good job, the Jewish people, of explaining ourselves to members of Congress, to other constituencies. There was a pro-Israel advocacy organization that opened an office in China. And no one has ever thought to explain to Palestinians and to the Arab world generally who we are and why we're there, what our story is. And just to give you an idea of how little the Arab world understands about our story, I got a response to the book just recently, a couple of weeks ago, from a Saudi religious leader who signed his name, invited me to come to Saudi Arabia. And he said, "I never realized that the Jews and the Hebrews are the same. So of course you're part of this region. Of course you're not European colonialists. You belong here." And that's just one example of the kinds of responses that I've been getting. The book was translated into Arabic, released in Arabic the same day that it came out in English last year, and that was very important for me for what I felt was the integrity of the book. And it was offered for free downloading in Arabic. And I've gotten several thousand responses so far, many of them not good, many of them quite negative, some of them intriguing, and I would say a few dozen that are genuinely warm and speak of a transformative experience from reading this book. The reason that I wrote this is because I believe that the heart of the conflict is not about tangible issues, which are the issues that the diplomats deal with. A line on the map, settlements, holy places, those are all obviously crucial issues. But they're consequences of the conflict. They're not the root cause of the conflict. The root cause are the intangible issues, the right to exist, legitimacy, the right to define oneself as a nation. Now, for many years in Israel, we denied that the Palestinians were a people. You still hear that among some Jews. I would say less in Israel than on the American Jewish right, interestingly. And yet, the voice that really represented that position in Israel was Golda Meir from the Labor Party. And Golda Meir in the 1970s made a statement saying there's no such thing as a Palestinian people. In today's Israel, a credible leader would not say such a thing. Even Netanyahu has acknowledged the existence of a Palestinian people, and at one point accepted a two-state solution, whether he meant it or not is a separate issue. But it says something about the nature of political discourse in Israel, that issue, that debate, has largely been resolved. There's a Palestinian people, that people is living under occupation. We have a very serious conflict with the Palestinian national movement, which still to this day does not accept our legitimacy, and that's something most Israelis believe deeply. I do as well. And so I wanted to go to the heart of what I felt was the conflict, which is the question of indigenousness. For me, the conceptual basis for an agreement is for each side to acknowledge the very painful reality that in this little tortured land, there are two national entities. Each side wishes the other wasn't there. And that's, if you are fighting in an existential war for 100 years, that's a natural conclusion for both sides. Both sides would be very happy to wake up one morning and discover that the other side isn't there. It's not going to happen. We're going to have to learn to live together in this intimate space. And by intimate space, just to give you an idea, from my porch at the edge of French Hill, I can literally see three political entities. There's the sovereign state of Israel, which ends outside my porch, the road just before the security barrier. There is the Palestinian Authority in the near distance. And then there are the lights of Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, which I see very clearly at night from my porch. Jordan is about a 15-minute drive from where I live. Three political entities. And if and when there will be a Palestinian state, I will be able to see three states from my porch. And the reason that I'm emphasizing this is the need for realism when we speak about peacemaking. I'm of the generation of the Oslo process. I came of age as an Israeli. I was drafted during the first Intifada of the late 1980s. I served in Gaza. And that was my realization that the status quo isn't working. And if you think about Sharon's withdrawal from Gaza, Ariel Sharon, 2005, Sharon is the guy who built the settlements in Gaza. People forget this. We only remember that he withdrew from the settlements. Sharon built every one of those settlements. He knew every house, every road. And if he came to the conclusion that it wasn't workable, then my sense is that it really came from that experience of realizing that we cannot permanently occupy another people and still be a Jewish majority state and a democratic state. At the same time, most Israelis today recognize that we are very far from an agreement with the Palestinians. If we were to withdraw tomorrow from the territories, from the West Bank, chances are that we would find ourselves with Hamas in the West Bank. And so the way that I would define my approach to the conflict is that half of me is left-wing, half of me believes deeply that we need to withdraw, we need to end the disaster of ruling over another people. I served in Gaza, my son served in Gaza. At some point, we need to come to terms with the fact that this can't continue. The status quo is untenable for the long run. And yet the other half of me is right. The other half of me says, wait a minute, you live in the most dangerous region on the planet. You live in a region that is disintegrated, where one country after another is tearing itself apart. And we need to be realistic about every move that we make. And so what I've just described to you is very much the normative position of the blue and white party, which actually beat the Likud in these last, now, 2 elections. I did an event last week with a Palestinian friend who responded to my book, and he was talking about the lack of elections in the Palestinian Authority, and I said the problem in the Middle East is that the Palestinians have too few elections, and we have too many. And so there really is something in that, in this sense of, but we'll leave that for perhaps the conversation. So the blue and white party represents this centrist perspective, which has brought together the left and the right, the insights of the left and the right. For me, the left and the right are not happening outside in two rival camps. They're not arguing they're not two distinct and opposing ideologies. They're arguing inside of me. They're tearing me apart. And that, I think, is true for many, many Israelis today. And I find that the American Jewish conversation on Israel needs to understand the Israeli center. Because that is where, for me, the most interesting and significant transformation is happening. The Israeli left has collapsed. And the Israeli left collapsed in the year 2000. It collapsed with the Second Intifada, but not only because of the terrorism. It collapsed because most Israelis, like myself, are convinced that we really tried to end the occupation and we did not have a partner on the other side. And instead, we ended up with the worst wave of terrorism in our history after we accepted a two-state solution. That realization transformed Israeli politics. The left became the center, the right became harder right, everything shifted rightward. That's Israel today. But I find that the center is really the place of nuance, is the place where the argument is happening inside of ourselves. And it's the place that I find really the most hope for. And I'm also emphasizing this because I wrote this book from a centrist perspective. I know some of you have read the book, it is not a left-wing book. And that sometimes is disorienting for American Jews, because it's a book about peace, it's a book about outreach, it's empathy for Palestinian suffering, it supports a two-state solution, and yet it's not a left-wing book. And it's not a left-wing book for several reasons. One is it doesn't place the blame on Israel for the lack of peace. And I accept that the Palestinians have a very different narrative, a very different reading for why peace hasn't happened. And I invite Palestinian responses. And I've included Palestinian responses in the new edition of the book. In fact, the new edition, the paperback, which just recently came out, has 50 pages of a new epilogue of letters from Palestinians to their Israeli neighbor. Some of those letters are very hard for me as an Israeli to read. And initially, I thought that I might respond to them in the book. And in the end decided I need to give the people who had the courage to write to me, I need to give them the last word of the book. And so a book that was written to defend the Israeli narrative in Palestinian society has now given the Palestinian voice the last word. And I think that was a very important message. And what I'm trying to do there is model a conversation between a mainstream centrist Israeli and mainstream Palestinians. And my message to Palestinians is it might be easier for you to try to make peace with left-wing Israelis, but you will find yourself on the periphery of Israeli society. The real conversation has to be with Israelis like myself, who are very wary of the Middle East, who do not trust Palestinian leaders, who don't feel guilty for the occupation. I want our occupation of the Palestinian people to end. I want it desperately to end, for my sake, for the future of Israel. Never mind for the future of the Palestinians. And yet, people like me, really, I think, are those who need to hear Palestinian voices saying, we affirm your legitimacy. And that's what I was looking for in this book. In reaching out to Palestinians, I was inviting them into a conversation based on the premise that we are both indigenous peoples. And I did that partly because I needed to hear those voices. I needed to hear those voices to shake me out of my own despair. Because for many years after the Second Intifada, I would not have been capable of writing this book. I would not have been capable of reaching out to Palestinians. And what changed for me was getting involved with a program at Hartman called the Muslim Leadership Initiative, which should have been in the bio, actually. It's an old bio. And the Muslim Leadership Initiative, MLI, brings young emerging Muslim American leaders to the Institute of Jerusalem. We teach them about Judaism, Israel, Jewish identity, peoplehood, which is the crucial piece of Jewish identity that most Muslims don't understand about who we are. And you'll hear this over and over again from Muslims. We have nothing against Jews as a religion. It's just Israel, and you're not a real people. You're a fake people. And so what we try to do in this program is explain the basics of Jewish identity, the relationship, the interrelationship between peoplehood, land, sovereignty, religion. And as a result of my involvement with MLI, with Muslim American leaders, who were tremendously courageous in coming to a Zionist institution to study Judaism in Israel. As a result of that experience, which has been going on now for 7 years, two things happened to me. The first is that I began to understand how Muslims view this conflict, and I began to experience something of their trauma, their pain. And my narrative of the conflict did not change, but my emotional relationship to the conflict changed. I began to force myself to open up again to Palestinian suffering. And I see Palestinians from my porch day and night. But I had taught myself, and I think this is true for many of us in Israel, it's as if I had taught my eye not to see. And so my eye went over the wall, past the Palestinian villages to this very beautiful, expansive view outside my porch. I could see the Dead Sea from my porch. And that's what I looked at for many years after the Second Intifada. And being involved with Muslim American leaders really forced me to re-engage with my Palestinian neighbors, to pay attention. And as a result of that experience, I started meeting Palestinians and wanting to have this connection. The second thing that the Muslim Leadership Initiative taught me was a language. How to speak about Israel and Zionism to Muslims. Now that's a religious language. That's very comfortable for me as a religious Jew. But what I learned from my Muslim students, who were also my teachers, is that if we're going to really try to find our place in the Middle East, it has to happen through religion, at least partly through religion. You can't make peace in the Middle East on the basis of Western notions and Western language. Peace Now, the Israeli left, which is very well-intentioned, is largely incapable of making peace with the Middle East because culturally and spiritually they don't speak the language of the Middle East. They speak the language of the West. And the part of the irony in Israel is that those Israelis who are most able to speak to the Middle East, and I'm thinking of religious Jews, I'm thinking of Mizrahim, Jews from Arab countries, tend to be those Israelis who aren't interested in having a conversation with the Arab world. While those Israelis who are interested in a conversation with the Arab world tend to be secular, left-wing, and Ashkenazi, and don't have that easy cultural connection. They don't have that cultural connection with Mizrahim, let alone with the Arab world. And so what I've tried to do in this book is create a language that is not left-wing, that is a centrist language, that's a religious or spiritual language, as a way of speaking to Palestinians. And I got confirmation from some of the Palestinians who responded to the book that that language really resonated for them. One of the people whom I included in the paperback edition, a young man named Yossi who recently published a very powerful book about growing up in Gaza during the Second Intifada called The Words of My Father. And Yossi read the book and responded, wrote me a letter, and I published it in the new edition. And what he wrote in that letter was, this was the first time that he was ever able to hear a Zionist argument because I was speaking about God and faith. And that made it possible for him to open up to my story. Now, the other piece of this, when I speak about a centrist perspective, the book is written very much from a 21st century Israeli narrative. And one of the implicit arguments of the book is that we are telling an old story about Israel. We are telling a 20th century story about Israel that is no longer true to what Israel is and actually does Israel a tremendous disservice. The 20th century story of Israel is a Eurocentric story. It begins with the pogroms in Tsarist Russia, and it culminates in the Holocaust. And that story is not only a European Jewish story, it's also a story about refuge. It is the Zionism of refuge. The problem with that story is twofold. First of all, it erases the story of Israel as a Middle Eastern story. A majority of Jews in Israel today trace their family origins to the Middle East. They come from families that left one part of the Middle East and moved to another part. The notion that Israel is a European construct plays into the hands of those who would demonize Israel as a colonialist invention. And the argument is, well, okay, the Holocaust that you suffered, but why should the Palestinians pay the price for what Europe did to you? That argument means nothing to more than half of Israelis. And the other piece of this is that when we only tell a story about the Zionism of refuge, we're not telling the other half of the story of Zionism, which is the Zionism of longing. The extraordinary 2,000-year-old story of a people that lost its land, but never gave up its connection with the land that it lost, and maintained the kind of vicarious indigenousness with this land until the time came when we were able to return. And that's a story that we need to retell, the spiritual story of Zionism. That, for me, is a 21st century story. So, in the end, this book is really an attempt to reach out, to tell a different story about Israel and Zionism to Palestinians, to the Arab world, and to invite Palestinians to tell me their story. If I'm asking Palestinians to hear my story, I'd better be ready to hear theirs. And maybe it's because I'm a writer and I think in terms of stories, but I see this conflict as fundamentally a war between irreconcilable stories. By irreconcilable stories, I mean that we will continue to disagree about the most basic issues of this conflict. For me, 1948, the founding of Israel, is one of the greatest moments, not just in Jewish history, but in world history. It is a moment of justice, of ultimate expression of justice. For Palestinians, it's exactly the opposite. For me, 1967 is an expression of the right of a nation to self-defense against an attempted war of genocide. For the Arab world generally, and especially for Palestinians, it's an act of aggression. It's an Israeli land grab. The year 2000, the end of the Oslo process, for me, it's the fault of the Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian narrative. Israel didn't make the offer that it said it did. We live in the conflict is a mirror image. And what I'm looking for are two things. First first of all, a way to respectfully speak about each other's stories, that we sit at the same table, we're in the same room, and we hear each other's stories. And I've begun having these conversations with Palestinians. I've been invited to meet very quietly, very under the radar, with groups of Palestinians in the West Bank. They're very painful conversations and exhilarating at the same time. And the other thing that I'm looking for is modeling a conversation in which I will find partners on the Palestinian side with whom I can have a conversation whose starting point is two indigenous peoples. And again, the word indigenous for me is everything in this conflict. And then we can disagree about everything else. So let me turn this over now to Rabbi Mike, and we'll continue. Thank you.
So, Yossi, thank you. In rereading the book in the last couple of days, and in your talk already, there's so many questions to dig in on. We're going to have limited time. I want to invite students to write other questions on cards. I have a list of questions from students that came before. And what I'd like to do is to ask you to speak a little bit more personally, directly to the folks in the room. Because I think Penn is not a super politically divisive place. It's a very pragmatic place. And yet, I hope I'm getting this right, I think it is still in the ether, right? It's in the ether of this moment where Jewish students are walking around with a sense of, there's like a kind of blanket that says anything that screams of particularism is wrong. That universalism is a safer and better way to go. That the narrative is that there's a hierarchy of power, and so if you are part of a group that is safer, wealthier, and has more access, the idea of you standing up and asserting your narrative is an act of some kind of violence, of silencing someone else's narrative who needs to be amplified. And that, and I can imagine that there are people in the room who think like, it is a courageous thing to try to stand up and assert a Jewish narrative and a Zionist narrative. But there also might be discomfort around this idea of, we're both indigenous people, how can we be trying to claim indigenous when, you know, it just seems so obvious that they're, right? And so what I'm wondering is, to speak really as personally as you can, why is that okay to have the courage to tell that story? Why is it okay, maybe even helpful, to explore the indigenous nature of the Jewish connection to the land? And what I'd love is also to add one other piece, is to say something about like, how does it make sense, right? In other words, yes, if we go back to biblical times, or to kind of almost like an ancient mythical time, like the idea of like the Roman destruction of the temple seems almost mythical at this point. How does that have anything to do with current politics in 2019? If you could try to like put some flesh on that bone,
Right.
it would be helpful.
All great question. My decision to tell our story by reaching out to my Palestinian neighbors is a very 21st century move. It's a 21st century way of telling the Jewish story, which means that we can't tell our story anymore only to ourselves. We don't live in a vacuum in the 21st century. We live in, for better or for worse, we live in intimate and very complicated relationships, certainly in Israel and the Middle East, with the other. And the other isn't so other anymore, certainly not in America. And so my decision to tell my story, and it's a very personal book, it's the Israeli and Jewish narrative through a very personal lens. That decision to tell that story, not to all of you, because I was very aware and hoped that young American Jews would read the book. But I could only tell that story in the end if I was telling it also, or primarily, to my Palestinian Now, in terms of the relevance of our story, and I really appreciate this question. I'm writing a book now about the particularist universalist divide in the Jewish people, because I think that that is the defining issue for the 21st century, the question you just asked me. And we had better start thinking more deeply about what it means to be Jewish and the relationship between the particular and the universal in Jewish identity if we're going to think of taking this story into the future. And for me, in some ways, and again, I'm speaking as a writer, for whom language is the essence. For me, being Jewish means owning a Jewish language. And a Jewish language gives me access, intimate access, to thousands of years of history. There are very few peoples in the world today that have an unbroken memory from ancient times. When you enter into Jewish identity, you become a contemporary of thousands of years. It's not abstract. So when you talk about, from the outside, the destruction of the temple 2,000 years ago is something abstract and mythic. For me, I fast for the destruction of the temple. I read Josephus, the great historian, and I read it as a living text. I live there. It's all real. But you don't actually have to live there to inhabit Jewish time. Jewish time means that you are not confined to decades or even centuries in terms of what you regard as belonging to you. Jewish time means that you have most of human history accessible, that you can enter in and out of different periods of human history. Sometimes it seems to me that the debates within the Jewish people are really different eras of Jewish history arguing with each other. You think about the different camps of the Jewish people and what periods and what values from Jewish history they're embodying. So that, we could talk about that for hours, and I wish we could, but in shorthand, it really is Jewish time. The other piece of this I've because of this book that I'm writing now, I've been kind of looking back at some basic Jewish sources and rethinking. So, for example, the founding of the Jewish story is the book of Genesis. God tells Abraham, leave your home, leave everything you know, and go to the land that I will show you. Now, that is the first sentence in the Hebrew Bible of the founding of the Jewish story. And it is an act of particularism. It's an act of radical separation. But then, 2 lines later, God explains to Abraham why he is separating him from the nations, so that all the nations will be blessed through you. In other words, an extreme particularist move is happening here with the founding of the Jewish people for the sake of blessing the world. And so built into our DNA as a people is this particularist universalist tension, which we're carrying for thousands of years. We're not the first generation to wonder, why are we carrying a particularist story? What's the balance between the particular and the universal? And I think that our generation really has a tremendous opportunity to, and I want to think of Jewish life today more as an opportunity than a crisis. We have a tremendous opportunity to rethink the particular universal balance, because certainly in America, you're living in a situation, and we are under Jewish sovereignty in Israel, of expansiveness, of a certain, for all the threats that we live with, we nevertheless live with a great deal of security, certainly compared to previous generations. You asked another question.
I don't remember exactly. I also read about 28 questions in the intro.
Okay.
But what I'd like to do is, I want to underscore like a main thing I'm hearing from you and then ask a different question, which is, I think it seems like we live in this age where there are knee-jerk and black and white responses to everything. And what you said in your talk and what you just reiterated is like if you zoom out, if you think about it in Jewish time, if you think about it from a Jewish textual perspective, you are modeling tonight, constantly holding tensions as opposed to binary answers. I just wanted to underscore that. I think it's been running through everything you've said. Because there are a lot of really good questions that are coming up. I want to ask a next one. You touched on this in your talk a little bit about when you speak with Palestinians, you constantly hear, we have no problem with Jews, the issue is the Zionists. And so I think that there are a couple terms that get mingled, and I would love for you to kind of take a stab at trying to define, either to separate them or to define the tipping point. So one is like, can you divide Zionist and Jew? Is that idea like, oh, it's not the Jewish thing, it's the Zionist thing, and is that can you actually divide it in that way? And the second is that I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm only anti-Israel, right? Which you didn't mention, but I think there's an analog there.
Look, there are Jews, there are groups of Jews who are not just non-Zionists, but anti-Zionist. You have on the fringes of the ultra-Orthodox community groups like Satmar and the Karta that are anti-Zionist. There is a difference between the anti-Zionism of Satmar and even the Karta and the anti-Zionism that you'll encounter on campus. The anti-Zionism of Satmar says, of course it's our land, but we believe that only the Messiah can return us to the land, and when the Messiah comes, we will have the restoration of Jewish sovereignty. So I would call that a kind of anti-Zionism that's really a sublimated, deferred Zionism. That's really what they're playing out. Even the Turei Karta go over there and in the anti-Zionism that is increasingly fashionable today, there is the denial of the Jews as a people. I just saw a tweet from the founder of SJP, of Students for Justice for Palestine, who wrote, "We must dismantle this false notion of the Jews as a people." It's a tweet the other day. And so that is a direct assault on my being, on my identity. The other piece of this is, for me, I think that the debate over Zionism was legitimate, maybe even essential, until the Jews actually succeeded in creating a state. The moment we returned and did it, what anti-Zionism today means, as opposed to when it was still theoretical, when it was still an ideological debate, what it means today is effectively genocide against 7 million Jews in Israel. The world's largest Jewish community. We will not raise the white flag. Israel will not simply fade away. And so the anti-Zionist position is a declaration of war against the lives of millions of Jews. That's one level. The other level is, and here's where I think it's really important for Jews to assert the dignity of our position. And that is that there's one place on the planet where time and public space is defined by the Hebrew calendar, where Jewish history informs the present and the future, where as an Israeli, I have a sense of responsibility to Jews around the world. Now it's more complicated because Israel is not only a Jewish state, it's also a democratic state. My definition of Israel, which I take, it's from my reading of our Declaration of Independence, is very straightforward. Israel is the state of every Jew, whether or not you are a citizen of Israel. And it is the state of every citizen, whether or not you are a Jew. Now, Netanyahu recently said, Israel is not the state of all of its citizens. Now, of course it's the state of all of its citizens. it's also the state of all Jews who are not necessarily citizens of Israel. That's a very complicated identity to hold, and it requires delicate balance and sensitivity. But if we don't hold that identity, we will be doing basic violence to Israel's essence. And that's true, on the one hand, for those who want to abolish Israel's Jewish identity, the anti-Zionists. And it's true for those Israelis who want to, on the hard right, who want to abolish Israel as a democracy. The net result of either of those approaches is to destroy this delicate balance between Israel as a Jewish state and Israel as a democratic state.
Do you want to say one or two words about, can you separate the idea of Jew from Zionist?
You can separate the idea of Jew from Zionist as a political idea, but I think what the anti-Zionist Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, show us is that you can't separate Jewish identity and Judaism from the land of Israel. You can come to the conclusion and say, well, it was a mistake to create the state of Israel. Okay, that's certainly, my position is quite the opposite. I think the state of Israel saved the Jewish people in many ways. One example is, and this is something that we pay no attention to, but if you look at the disintegration of much of the Arab world over the last decade, we're talking about Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Libya. These were countries that 70, 80 years ago had very substantial Jewish populations. Imagine the fate of Jews in those countries today if they had found refuge in Israel. So this, it's a really interesting paradox, because Zionism was founded by European Jews to save European Jewry, and it failed. Zionism did not succeed in saving European Jewry, but it did succeed in saving the Jews of the East. And that's something that we realized only in 2019. We didn't realize it until these last years, when looking at the rise of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, the disintegration of Yemen, and realizing what would the fate of the Jewish minorities be in the Middle East. Would they be the Yazidis? Would they be the Kurds? There are no minorities in the Middle East today that live securely. And the only minority in the Middle East that succeeded in learning how to defend itself and regain national sovereignty are the Jews in the Middle East.
So we're going to try to squeeze in two last questions. There were a bunch of questions that came up that asked different versions of the same thing, which is, given the intensity and depth of those two competing narratives that we talked about, given some of the political complexity, there were a whole bunch of questions around, should anyone young feel a sense of hope about a path towards peace? And if you could imagine a pragmatic way forward, what do you imagine that looking like?
I'd rather not, well, okay. I'll answer it very briefly, and then I really want to say something a little more substantive. The old thinking in Israel was that we're going to make peace with the Middle East from what we used to call the inside out. The inside out is, first you make peace with the Palestinians, and then that will reverberate and we'll make peace with the whole Arab world. Today the thinking is the opposite. Today the thinking is that with the rise of Iran, we now have a shared interest in creating defense pact with much of the Arab world. And we will be making peace with the Arab world, and that will help us make peace with the Palestinians. And I tend to think that that's the more realistic way to go today. But what I really wanted to say to you guys is, in terms of hope, and as an Israeli, I don't deal with the question of optimism or pessimism. It's not part of the Israeli vocabulary. Israelis are realists who believe in taking life one day at a time, but who also know instinctively that our very existence is an aberration. You can use, I use the language of miracle, but you could use a different, more neutral language of aberration. And that gives us a sense, on the one hand, of deep pragmatism, almost cynicism, although I don't think Israelis as a whole are cynical people. It gives us a very deep rootedness in the pragmatic, but also at the same time, a sense of the infinitely possible. And I certainly have that as an Israeli. And do I believe that peace is imminent? No, peace is not imminent. Do I believe that peace is possible, maybe even likely in the long term? I suppose I do. I don't think about it. I don't let myself think about it. I don't want to open myself up to wishful thinking. It's very, very important. It's one of the ways we cope with living in Israel, is we avoid wishful thinking. And yet, there really is this sense of, I would call it, faith. And I think Israelis generally are people of faith. Whether they believe in God or not, they're people of faith. They believe in, whether it's Jewish history, whether it's some sense of destiny. I think most Israelis, to one extent or another, have that.
Do we have time for one more question? Okay. So there were also, this came up in about 6 or 7 cards. Mike Pompeo, yesterday or 2 days ago, said that the U.S. has changed its position and that civilian settlements in the West Bank should not be considered by international law to be illegal. And from the perspective of the American government, are no longer considered illegal.
Yeah.
And just reactions, the opportunities, risks, threats that creates, does that mean anything in the real world?
Yeah, I don't think it really does. I think that for me, the question of whether it's legal by international law or not legal, I've read different opinions, one way or the other. A majority, strong majority of opinion is that it is illegal. There is a minority opinion that it's not illegal. I don't really care, honestly, about that. I care about the impact on our ability to have peace. I care about the destructive process which the settlements are pushing us in, where we are moving more and more toward a one state, and a one state is a disaster, because a one state will more likely resemble Yugoslavia or Syria or Iraq rather than the U.S. Although the U.S., I have to tell you guys, you're not looking so good these days. I've had more conversations with friends, the last year or two, who say, maybe the blue states should secede. So I don't, I wish this country every good thing. I'm worried. And certainly the notion that after fighting a 100-year war, Israelis and Palestinians are going to be able to create a happy one-state solution is the ultimate Middle East fantasy. So I don't think the question of legal or illegal, for me, is irrelevant. It's destructive. In principle, I believe that Jews have the right to live in every part of the land of Israel, just as in principle I believe Palestinians have the right to live in every part of what is the land of Palestine. And the tragedy of this conflict is that between the river and the sea there are two conceptual territories. There's the land of Israel. All of the land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, for me, as a centrist Israeli, not as a right-wing Israeli, as a centrist Israeli, it's all land. It's all the land of Israel. The problem is, there's another people there. And for that people, all of the land from the river to the sea, including what is the state of Israel, is the land of Palestine. And my response is, you're right. When Palestinians tell me that Haifa is Palestine, my response is, you're right. It is Palestine. The problem is that Hebron is the land of Israel. So what do? What you do is what we really don't want to do, and that is cut this land, this little land, into two entities. I don't want to do it. I hate the idea of doing it. I fear it, but I don't see a solution. I don't see an alternative. So in that sense, these are games. You know, it is legal, it isn't legal. I don't care. I care about the consequences. Stay with you guys. And that is, I want to go back to something you raised earlier, Mike, which is this question of what does it mean to be Jewish, this particularism today. And the book that I'm working on now is called The Wisdom of Survival, and it's trying to understand what is this 4,000-year story that we've carried, and what is the meaning of this story for humanity. In particular, what does a people that is history's great survivor people, that has survived every epoch and epic of human history, what does this people have to say to the world in an era of apocalyptic dread? This is the first time in human history when we can't take human survival for granted. We've never experienced anything like this before. And as a result of that, there's this growing sense of despair from so many different directions. When you talk about a future, it's not only a future in Israel, it's a future, does America have a future? Does the world have a future? And the inconceivable is becoming routine. So we as a people, I feel, we have a deep wisdom of survival in our DNA that we need to start figuring out. We need to start asking ourselves, what does this story mean? Did we survive somehow for this moment? And there's something else happening at this moment, which is that for 2,000 years, the world didn't pay attention to the Jews, except in a negative sense. We were not talking to the world as a people. We spoke to the world as individuals. There was Freud, there were others who spoke to the world, who influenced the world as individuals. But we stopped talking to the world as a people after the biblical era. That was the last time we had a real impact on human history as a people. Today, the world is paying attention to the Jews again. We are really central in international discourse, not always in a positive way, but we are very important to the human story. And so, getting the Jewish story right, figuring out what we have to tell the world, based on our story, based on who we are. I feel that this is a moment that has tremendous opportunity for us to begin to understand ourselves and to start speaking to the world in a way that we haven't spoken to the world since the days of the prophets. And that will require a whole new way of thinking about who we are and about what the relationship is between the particular person.
Thank you. So, I get a sense of how eloquent and wise and insightful he is. He's actually even better in print than he is in person, and you should just buy all his books, go home for Thanksgiving. Your parents would be failing if you bring a Jewish book home for them as a gift. So whether it's Letters to a Palestinian Neighbor or like Dreamers about the Six-Day War or other books that Yossi's written, they're really inspiring and beautiful. And we have a student thank you and a gift as well.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
Just as a token of our thanks to that Allah. And also a big thank you to the finest. Just a huge thank you to everyone who showed up and showed out, whether it's your first time here or you're here all the time. Really, thank you from the bottom of our hearts. I speak for the board, Penn Israel Alliance, when we say we put a lot of effort and thought into this event, and we're so glad that you could come. Thank you again.